Open any kitchen cabinet in 1976. Really look, past the Harvest Gold canister set, past the avocado green Tupperware, past the orange laminate shelves that every home improvement magazine swore were the future of American taste. Look at what's actually sitting there. A jar of maraschino cherries glowing a neon red that no cherry has ever produced on its own. A tub of Cool Whip with that plasticky sheen, the kind of white that belongs more to a vinyl countertop than to a dairy product. A cardboard canister of powdered drink mix that, when you lift the foil seal, releases a strange chemical lemon peel smell, closer to dish soap than to any fruit that ever hung from a tree. A can of creamed corn, a box of Hamburger Helper, a freezer brick of Salisbury steak and brown gravy. What you'd find inside those cabinets tells a story. And the story isn't about bad mothers or lazy cooks or a generation that stopped caring. The story is about a chemistry-set industry that had, for a while, almost no rules. An industry that was allowed to experiment on the American pantry at a scale we have never really seen before or since. An industry whose inventions were sold with warm-lit commercials promising convenience, abundance, and a kind of manicured cheerfulness that seemed, at the time, like the reward for winning the war and building the suburbs. So tonight, we're going to walk through the actual evidence. What was really in 1970s processed food? Who put it there? And who, against long odds, finally stood up and said, "Wait a minute, let's take a closer look." This isn't a ghost story. It isn't a scare piece. It's a cultural investigation. And the clues are still sitting on supermarket shelves today. Let's begin with the first clue. It starts not in the 1970s, but in the years right after the Second World War. The American chemical industry came out of that war transformed. Factories that had been built to produce explosives, synthetic rubber, and wartime medicines suddenly needed peacetime work. And food was a natural pivot. Food needed preservation, color, flavor, shelf life, emulsification, and above all, consistency. Because the new post-war supermarket economy was built on the idea that a can of peaches in Tulsa should taste exactly the same as a can of peaches in Tallahassee every single time, forever. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s and 60s, American chemists were producing thousands of new food additives, preservatives, dyes, stabilizers, humectants, artificial sweeteners, artificial flavors so precise that a laboratory in New Jersey could bottle the idea of strawberry without a strawberry ever entering the building. In 1958, Congress passed the Food Additives Amendment. Inside that law was a clause that would become one of the most argued-over phrases in American food regulation. The phrase was generally recognized as SAFE, GRAS for short. The idea behind GRAS was practical. If an ingredient had been used widely in American food for a long time, and if qualified experts considered it safe, it didn't need to go through the full approval process that a brand new chemical required. Salt was GRAS. Vinegar was GRAS. But the way manufacturers were allowed to self-affirm new additions over the years ended up being looser than almost anyone outside the industry understood. By the late 1960s, the FDA was quietly sitting on a backlog of hundreds of GRAS ingredients that had never been reevaluated with modern science. Pause for a second. Picture a filing cabinet in a Washington office building in 1970. Folder after folder of additive names, many approved decades earlier, some barely studied. And picture the executive suites on Madison Avenue, a few hundred miles north, full of people whose entire job was to make those additives feel like magic. Which brings us to our second clue, because the chemistry boom didn't sell itself. It was sold, eh? and it was sold by what many historians now call the golden age of American advertising. The 1960s and 70s were the years of Madison Avenue at its peak influence, the years that the show Mad Men would later fictionalize. Food advertising in particular exploded. A single half-hour Saturday morning cartoon block on a major network might carry a dozen ads for sugared cereals, each one starring a cartoon mascot designed by a studio that also did children's animation for Disney and Warner Brothers. Tony the Tiger, Cap'n Crunch, Lucky the Leprechaun, Toucan Sam, Sonny the Cocoa Puffs bird, cheerful, loud, friendly, everywhere. And it wasn't just cereal. Kool-Aid Man crashed through brick walls. The Pillsbury Doughboy giggled when you poked him. The Jolly Green Giant stood over a valley of peas. Coca-Cola taught the world to sing in perfect harmony on a hilltop in Italy. Every one of these campaigns was backed by research, focus groups, and budgets that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Food and beverage companies were among the top 3 ad categories on American television for the entire decade. Here's why that matters for our investigation. The ads got loudest and most elaborate exactly where the food was most processed, most novel, most dependent on new industrial ingredients. TV dinners needed a sell. Powdered orange breakfast drinks needed a sell. Spray cheese needed a sell. Coffee whiteners needed a sell. The ad industry's golden age and the food industry's chemistry boom were two halves of the same machine. Step back from the television set. Walk back into that 1976 kitchen. Open the refrigerator. Inside is a bottle of bright orange citrus, soda, something with the word tropical or sunshine in the name. Turn the bottle around. Look at the ingredient panel. You may see a phrase that very few shoppers in 1976 would have read carefully. Brominated vegetable oil. Brominated vegetable oil, or BVO, was added to certain citrus-flavored sodas to keep the citrus oils evenly distributed in the liquid. It had been used in American soft drinks since the 1930s. Over time, researchers began raising questions about how bromine behaved in the human body, and regulators in several countries began moving against it. BVO would eventually be phased out of American sodas, with the FDA finalizing a full revocation of its food additive authorization in 2024. In the 1970s, though, it was just another line of small print on the back of a bottle that children drank by the gallon. Now, this is the point in our investigation where we have to introduce our third clue. Because it was in exactly this landscape, the chemistry boom pantry, and the golden age ad break, that a small group of deeply unglamorous people began doing something that would change American food forever. They started reading the fine print out loud. The name you have to know first is Ralph Nader. Nader had already shaken the American automobile industry with his 1965 book Unsafe at Any Speed, which had helped force the creation of federal car safety standards. By the late 1960s, Nader had assembled teams of young researchers, often law students and recent graduates, who were nicknamed Nader's Raiders. They took on regulatory agencies the way a forensic accountant takes on a suspicious ledger. One of those Raiders projects, led by a researcher named James Turner, focused on the Food and Drug Administration itself. The resulting book, published in 1970, was called The Chemical Feast. Its argument, laid out in dense, footnoted chapters, was that the FDA had become too comfortable with the industries it was supposed to oversee, and that additives, dyes, and preservatives were being waved through on outdated assumptions. The Chemical Feast landed in Washington like a brick through a plate glass window. It didn't scream, it listed, it cited, it named additives and dates, and it gave journalists a toolkit for the next decade of reporting. Take a breath. Notice the texture of what we're describing. This isn't a conspiracy. This isn't a hidden cabal. This is a slow, bureaucratic paper trail story in which a regulatory system designed for an earlier, simpler pantry was trying, and often failing, to keep up with an industrial revolution inside the American kitchen. 1 year after the chemical feast, in 1971, a young microbiologist named Michael Jacobson joined forces with two colleagues, Albert Fritsch and James Sullivan, and founded a nonprofit called the Center for Science in the Public Interest. CSPI, as it became known, set up shop in Washington with a simple mission: to bring scientific evidence into public debates about food, nutrition, and health. Jacobson had cut his teeth working on Nader-style research. He and his colleagues were not marketers. They were not celebrities. They were the kind of people who would read a 40-page toxicology study on a Saturday afternoon and then write a 2-page summary for the public on a Sunday morning. CSPI's first decade is one of the most underappreciated chapters in American consumer history. They campaigned for clearer nutrition labeling. They pushed for honest ingredient lists. They challenged advertising aimed at children. They helped popularize the very concept of the ingredient panel as something ordinary shoppers should read. And they were not alone. Out in the counterculture, a very different kind of food activism was rising. In California, a man named Fred Rowe helped catalyze what would become the Natural Foods Co-op movement, writing for early natural foods publications, and helping set standards for what could be called organic at a time when the word had almost no legal meaning. Across the country, food co-ops, buying clubs, and whole-grain bakeries began to sprout in college towns and old industrial neighborhoods. Brown rice, bulk bins, glass jars, paper bags, and a quiet skepticism of the brightly colored box on the supermarket shelf. Pattern shift. Let's walk into a specific year, 1976. Bicentennial bunting on the porches, parades, fireworks. And, on a much less celebrated front, one of the most consequential food regulation decisions in modern American history. In January 1976, the Food and Drug Administration announced that it was terminating the provisional listing of a synthetic color additive called FD&C Red Dye No. 2. Red dye. Number 2, also known as amaranth, had been one of the most widely used red food colorings in the United States. It had turned up in candy, sausage casings, ice cream, pet food, cereal, and countless baked goods. For years, Soviet researchers had published studies raising questions about the safety of amaranth at high doses in rats. American scientists and regulators spent years reviewing and re-reviewing the data. In the end, the FDA concluded that the evidence was not sufficient to establish Red No. 2's safety, and it pulled the plug. It is important to be precise here. The FDA did not declare Red No. 2 proven harmful to humans at dietary doses. It declared that the available studies had not satisfactorily answered the questions raised about it. Under the law, that was enough to end its use. Think about what that meant inside the industry. Overnight, candy companies scrambled to reformulate. M&M's famously dropped their red candies for years, not because red M&M's used Red No. 2, but because consumers had become so confused about red dyes in general that Mars decided it wasn't worth the battle. Red No. 2 was not the only story. In 1969, the FDA had already banned cyclamate, one of the most popular artificial sweeteners of the 1960s, after animal studies raised cancer concerns. That ban wiped out an entire category of diet sodas almost overnight and pushed the industry toward saccharin. Saccharin then had its own reckoning. In 1977, after Canadian studies in rats suggested a potential bladder cancer link, the FDA proposed banning saccharin as well. Public outcry was enormous. Congress responded by passing a moratorium that prevented the ban and required warning labels instead. Decades later, after further study, regulators concluded that the rat mechanism did not translate to humans in the same way, and the warning label was eventually removed. Science got more information. Policy got updated. The system imperfectly corrected course. Pause. Sit with that for a moment, because this is the part of the story that gets flattened in clickbait retellings. The 1970s were not a decade in which regulators knew everything and hid it. They were a decade in which regulators often did not know enough, and the public, led by people like Nader and Jacobson, forced them to look harder. Let's keep going through the cabinet. Two more ingredients demand our attention. The first is monosodium glutamate, better known as MSG. In April 1968, a physician named Robert Hohmann-Quach published a short letter in the New England Journal of Medicine describing symptoms he said he experienced after eating at certain Chinese restaurants. That letter coined the phrase Chinese restaurant syndrome, a term now widely regarded as culturally loaded and scientifically imprecise. The letter kicked off decades of research and popular fear. The current scientific consensus, after many rigorous studies, is that the vast majority of people tolerate MSG without issue at normal dietary levels. Here again, a 1970s controversy looks very different from a 2020s vantage point. The history is real. The science moved. The second is the family of preservatives you may still see on labels today: BHA, butylated hydroxyanisole, and BHT, butylated hydroxytoluene. These compounds were added to fats, oils, breakfast cereals, potato chips, and chewing gum to delay rancidity. They are still permitted in many foods in the United States, although some studies have questioned them over the years, and several countries have moved to restrict them. BHA and BHT live in a regulatory gray zone where the honest answer is probably fine at typical dietary exposures, still studied, and not universally loved by scientists who prefer fewer industrial compounds in the daily diet. Another shift of angle. Walk from the dry pantry to the meat case. Here we find sodium nitrite and sodium nitrate, the curing salts that give bacon, ham, hot dogs, and bologna their characteristic pink color and their long shelf life. In the 1970s, concerns grew about the formation of compounds called nitrosamines when nitrite-cured meats are cooked at very high temperatures, particularly in bacon. The industry responded under regulatory pressure by adding ascorbic acid or erythorbic acid to curing mixes, which reduces nitrosamine formation. Public health groups, including the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Arm, have since classified processed meats as a risk factor for certain cancers when consumed regularly at high levels. That fact became visible, to a large extent, because of the ingredient panel culture that the 1970s activists built. Now we come to an ingredient that didn't start out as a villain: high-fructose corn syrup. In the late 1950s and through the 1960s, researchers including Richard O. Marshall and Earl R. Hoover at the corn products company's Argo Laboratory worked on enzymatic processes to convert corn-derived glucose into fructose. By 1967 to 1970, high-fructose corn syrup was becoming commercially available. By the late 1970s, American food manufacturers, looking at cheap, subsidized domestic corn and expensive imported sugar, began swapping cane sugar out for HFCS in everything from soft drinks to bread to ketchup. This shift cannot be separated from the farm policy of the era, and specifically from the tenure of Earl Butz as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1971 to 1976. Butz famously urged American farmers to plant fence row to fence row, to get big or get out. His push for maximum corn production, combined with commodity subsidies, made corn syrup an irresistible bargain for food manufacturers. What is not debated is that the 1970s policy environment changed the sweetness of American food in ways that touched nearly every processed product on the shelf. Take another breath. Look around at the sheer size of what we're mapping. Dyes, sweeteners, preservatives, emulsifiers, curing salts, syrups, flavor enhancers. All of them governed by a patchwork of laws and a regulatory agency that was, as Nader's Raiders had pointed out in 1970, often outgunned and underfunded. No wonder citizens began pushing back. And now we get to the political reveal of our story. In 1977, a Senate committee chaired by Senator George McGovern of South Dakota released a document with the dry title Dietary Goals for the United States. The McGovern Report, as it came to be known, was not a regulatory action. It was a set of recommendations from a congressional committee. But it was, at the time, remarkable. It told Americans that they should eat less saturated fat, less cholesterol, less sugar, less salt, and more whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. It tied diet explicitly to chronic diseases like heart disease and certain cancers, and it named the food industry's resistance directly. The McGovern Report triggered an uproar. The sugar, meat, and dairy industries pushed back hard. Lobbyists descended on the committee. Some language was softened in later drafts, but the report could not be unreleased. For the first time, the federal government had said, in a formal document, that what Americans were putting in their grocery carts, much of it assembled from 1970s industrial chemistry, was contributing to the nation's biggest killers. Every U.S. dietary guideline since 1980 has, in one way or another, grown from that root. Here is where another human figure enters the investigation. Peter Barton Hutt served as chief counsel of the FDA from 1971 to 1975. Hutt was not a crusading activist. He was a careful, by-the-book lawyer. But during his tenure and in the years after, he helped shape how the modern FDA interpreted its labeling authority, how it handled additive decisions, and how it balanced industry pressure against consumer protection. Heroes in this story, when they exist, look less like caped reformers and more like tired civil servants with good files. Pattern break. Let's stand up from the kitchen table, walk into the living room, and change the channel. It's a Saturday afternoon in 1979. A football game is on. A commercial break. A man in a lab coat holds up a tub of margarine made with partially hydrogenated vegetable oil and tells you that it is better for your heart than butter. Remember that image. Hold it in your mind, because the final big ingredient on our 1970s shelf is the one whose arc tells you the most about how hard this history is to judge in real time. Partially hydrogenated oils, trans fats. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Americans were actively told by respected health authorities to replace butter and lard with margarine, shortening, and vegetable oil spreads made by partial hydrogenation. The advice was grounded in the best cardiovascular science of the time, which focused heavily on saturated fat. Food manufacturers used partially hydrogenated oils in crackers, cookies, microwave popcorn, pie crusts, frozen dinners, and fried fast foods. It was everywhere. By the 1990s and 2000s, the picture shifted. A new generation of researchers produced strong evidence that the trans fats created by partial hydrogenation were themselves harmful to cardiovascular health, in some ways more clearly than the saturated fats they had replaced. The FDA required trans fat labeling starting in 2006. In 2015, the agency ruled that partially hydrogenated oils were no longer GRAS for use in human food, and set a phase-out that was largely complete by 2020. The 1970s advice wasn't corrupt. It was incomplete. When better evidence arrived, the rules changed. We should also mention two other characters from later chapters that began in this era. Red No. 3, another synthetic dye, was restricted in cosmetics in 1990 after studies in male rats, and then, after decades of petitions, had its food additive authorization revoked by the FDA in early 2025. And Olestra, the fat substitute also marketed as Olean, was approved for snack foods in 1996, well after our 1970s window, but it grew directly from the research culture of that earlier decade. Olestra's history, with its digestive side effects and its eventual retreat from most American grocery shelves, is another chapter in the same long investigation. So what is the reveal? What was really in 1970s processed food? It was not a single villain. It was not a secret poisoning. It was a sprawling, fast-moving, under-regulated catalog of industrial ingredients, some of which turned out to be fine at normal exposures, some of which were later banned, some of which were reformulated, and some of which we still argue about today. For most of the decade, the burden of proof often ran the wrong way. Manufacturers could introduce compounds under GRAS self-affirmation. Regulators had to chase problems after the fact. Consumers had almost no labeling tools to evaluate what they were buying. Advertising filled the knowledge vacuum with cartoon mascots and catchy jingles. A small group of activists, scientists, and lawmakers spent the decade dragging evidence into the light. Why does this matter? Because the habits we inherited from that decade are still on our shelves. The ingredient panel you scan at the grocery store today exists in the form it does because of fights that started in the 1970s. The very idea that a shopper has the right to know what is in a can of soup, in plain English, was once controversial. The idea that a food company should have to prove an additive safe before mass marketing it, rather than the public proving it harmful afterward, is still, in 2026, an unfinished argument. And here, finally, is the twist. The twist is that, in many ways, the 1970s were not the worst era of American processed food. They were the era in which America began, for the first time, to seriously push back. Earlier decades had plenty of sketchy additives, from lead-based food colorings in the 19th century to radium tonics in the 1920s. But those earlier eras lacked the institutional consumer protection infrastructure that the 1970s built. The decade we've been investigating is, in a real sense, the decade that invented modern food skepticism. The cabinet full of brightly colored boxes was real. So was the fluorescent-lit office where someone was quietly reading the back of every one of them. Which brings us, at last, to modern relevance. When you open an app on your phone today, scan the barcode on a breakfast cereal, and watch a little color-coded score tell you whether the product is, in that app's opinion, clean, moderate, or to avoid. You're standing at the end of a very long trail. When you see a snack bar in the checkout aisle, labeled with reassuring phrases like no artificial colors, no high-fructose corn syrup, no partially hydrogenated oils, you're reading the scar tissue of 1970s food fights. When you see a beverage company voluntarily drop brominated vegetable oil from its sodas, or a candy company voluntarily switch from synthetic to natural colorings, or a frozen food brand proudly print a short ingredient list on the front of the box. Those decisions were made in a market that learned, the hard way, to distrust chemistry without context. The Yuka app, the clean label certifications, the ingredient-focused bloggers and dietitians on social media, the slow food movement, the farm-to-table restaurant, the co-op grocery, the labeling laws in state after state, the international comparisons that consumers now make between a European formulation of a candy bar and an American one. All of it rhymes with 1970s history. Michael Jacobson and his colleagues at CSPI did not invent reading labels for fun. They invented reading labels as civic participation. Ralph Nader's Raiders did not write The Chemical Feast as entertainment. They wrote it so that the next generation of shoppers would have a fighting chance to understand their own pantries. History rhymes. The cabinet in 1976 was full of chemistry no one had asked the public to vote on. The cabinet in 2026 is full of choices, warnings, certifications, and counterclaims, arguments about seed oils and sweeteners and synthetic dyes, arguments that would have been familiar in their shape if not their specific.